I actually know a couple of things about most of you. Um, One is that based on research, 50% of you are not morning people. 50% of you, when the alarm went off in your hotel room this morning, were like, fuck. Right? Is that not right? I also know something else about you, that 99% of you will not remember 99% of what I'm about to share. You won't. You actually don't really remember anything that Ray and Maria just shared with you. It just whoosh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the 1% of my presentation that I think really matters. And I want you to hold on to that. If all you remember for the next 30 minutes is the 1%, I feel like I've accomplished what I set out to accomplish. And so the 1% is this. No matter what you are trying to do, to undertake a digital transformation of your bank, to deal with this thing called disruption, to figure out how to create a culture of innovation, to be a better business person, to be a better partner, to be a better parent, to be a better human. The only capacity that really, really matters, the only thing to get really, really good at, is your ability to understand the truth of the human. Because at the end of the day, that's all there is. It's not about the technology, it's not about the walls, it's not about the carpet, it's about our capacity to create value for each other. And it's that simple, but it turns out it's actually really hard. So to start with a story, which the story that I tell, by the way, is ironically not exactly true. It's like 99% true. And the story goes something like this. Last September, my wife, Kate, who may be in the audience, I don't know, she and I went out for dinner with 3 friends in downtown Boston, where we live. Sunday night, 7 p.m., North End, which is the Italian section of Boston. Get to a restaurant, kind of empty, round table. I'm visualizing the whole thing right now. Sit down, order drinks, and right out of the gate, it's just awkward. It's just weird. And these are pretty good friends, but for whatever reason, Sunday night, people are tired. I don't know. There's no connection. There's no conversation. And it's just weird. And so I do what I do. I fill voids. I just step in and I start chatting and I start cracking jokes and I start asking questions. And about 20 minutes into this conversation, that's not really a conversation, Kate, who's sitting across from me, looks at me and does this. Which, for those that don't know, means the polite version of that is, darling, I love you, please be quiet. The impolite version is, darling, I love you, shut the hell up. Whereupon I did what any mature adult would do. I pouted, and I immediately stopped talking, and I did not talk for another hour and a half, which made the awkward evening even more awkward. So we get to the end, we leave the restaurant, we're walking home, we're on the sidewalk. I turn to her and I say, what was that? What was this? And she looks at me and she says, darling, I love you. However, sometimes your energy can just be too much. And sometimes your words, you have so many words, you're so verbal, it's too much. And sometimes your questioning, your constant questioning is just too much. And I looked at her and I said, darling, I love you, and I get the energy thing. I own that. I get that. I get the verbal thing. I have a lot of words. I accept that. But what I don't accept is the idea of too many questions. I don't accept that. And the reason why I don't accept it is because I believe questioning is the root of all learning. Questioning is the root of all advancement. And questioning is the root of all successful innovation. And so the question for you all today, for us today, for me right now is, are we asking ourselves the right question to ensure that our investments in innovating ourselves, innovating our businesses, innovating the world are successful. And the data would suggest not so much. 75% of startups fail. And I think that, it's kind of hard to see you guys, I think that's crazy. I think that's underreported. I think the number's more like 95%. 84% of digital transformation fails. There's a research study done recently that said in the last 10 years, $1.3 trillion have been spent on digital transformation. And my presumption is mostly by organizations in the financial services arena. 1.3 trillion. Of that, 900 billion has been determined to be of no value. Holy crap. Holy crap. And then thirdly, 95% of all corporate innovation fails. So these are the big companies with the big money and the big brains and the quote-unquote big ideas, and somehow it all ends up creating no value. Like, what the hell, right? So just think about that. Most innovation fails. Most transformation fails. A second view on this is this. 25% of college students in the United States today take some sort of psychotropic drug, which is a drug focused on either depression or anxiety. Sit with that for a second. 1 in 4, and that's probably underreported. 40% of American adults are obese. Number 2, catching up quickly, is Mexico. It's one of our more horrifying exports. Number 3, 1 in 4 Americans declare loneliness, isolation, as their sort of singular condition. And it is a condition. It turns out loneliness isn't just a social thing, it's a health thing. And it has the same impact on mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Now, my point there is the social consequences, the first set of like the failure of innovation and the second set of the failure of society, I believe, are intrinsically linked. There's not a direct correlation, but they're intrinsically linked. And they're linked based on us not asking the right question. And the question is this: do we understand humanity really? Do we understand the truth of the human really? And I think the answer is no. We look at the human as a simple proposition. From ape to erect person. A completely rational creature on the right, a completely irrational creature on the left. The fact of the matter is, humans are really, really complicated. Why we do what we do is complicated. Why we don't do what we should do is complicated. Why we shouldn't do what we do is complicated. It's all really complicated. We are really complicated. And it's even more complicated when you look at it through the lens of this guy. So how many know Maslow? You know Maslow's hierarchy of need? Raise your hand. Okay. So here's a to-do. In addition to the 1% I already shared, the other to-do is to look up Maslow and read about Maslow. So he was a psychologist in the 40s and 50s who came up with this construct called the hierarchy of need. And his simple proposition was that at the end of the day, humans are both complicated and primal. That what motivates our behaviors, our decisions, our choices, our actions is primal. It is not rational, it is not intellectual, it is primal. And it really all happens down at the bottom of the pyramid. We are fixated on serving physiological need, which is getting food, water, sleep, whatever, and we need safety. We constantly seek safety. We are cavemen fearing the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed tiger and strangers. To prove my point, I would like each of you to stand up right now, if that's not an inconvenience, and to turn around and introduce yourself to the person behind you. Come on, help me out. Come on, I know you can do this. Say hello. Okay. You can reconnect at the break. You now have new friends. Okay. So I need you all to be honest with yourselves right now and be honest with me. Some percentage of you, I feel like I'm going to like fall into the audience. Some percentage of you felt a little pang of fear, right? Some percentage of you, when you were like, oh my God, I have to turn around and meet a stranger. You know, shyness, the word shy is a euphemism for fear. People are shy because they're afraid. Shy isn't a thing, it's a manifestation of being afraid. So you were afraid to meet a stranger. We are primal creatures. And the wacky thing about fear of strangers is on the one hand, we fear strangers, and on the other hand, we seek their validation. Sean Parker, who was one of the co-founders of Facebook, once said, we knew we had $1 billion business on our hand when we realized the entire thing was about validation. Speaking of validation, here's another stat. 24% of American teenagers have sexted in the last 12 months. You guys know what sexting is? Sending naked photos of self to other people, potentially strangers. That's all about validation, and it all reflects the complexity of our humanity. You know, another way to think about this is the complexity of the human code is greater than the complexity of the technical code. And yet, we focus all of our energy on the technical code, and I think, my guess is because it's actually easier, because the human is really, really complicated. If you want to be successful with your innovation, and this includes innovation for your customer and innovation within the organization itself, Ray talked about the culture of innovation thing. If you want your employees to adopt a new way of being, if you want your customers to adopt a new application that you present to them, the benefits have to outweigh the costs. You go, well, duh, of course. But what we tend to miss in this simple equation is that the benefits and costs are multivariate. They're not single-variate. So if I say to you, what's the benefit of buying a cup of coffee at Starbucks? Somebody. Staying alive? Okay. A cup of coffee, right? The benefit is a cup of coffee. And what's the cost? $3.85, which is actually insane if you think about it. Or here at the hotel, it's like $5.85. But it's actually not that simple, right? The benefit of a cup of coffee at Starbucks is multivariate, right? There's the brand association, personalization, convenience if you use the mobile app. There are all sorts of benefits tied up in a simple cup of coffee, and there are all sorts of costs. So as you think about the introduction of an innovation and trying to figure out how to get the customer, whoever the customer might be, to adopt your innovation, you've got to look at it through a lens of multivariates. I mean, think about it more specifically. You know, money is both a cost and a benefit. That's called investing. Time is both a cost and a benefit. That's called working in order to get a vacation. My giving up ice cream is a cost, but the benefit is I look thin. Actually, the guy earlier this morning said I was thin. I'm like, I have had a great day, right? So the psychological, physiological need component is real, just like the cost component is real, just like the money component is real. And to make it all murkier, I believe this, that all major decisions in life are made emotionally. And you know, I said this to a group of MIT engineers a few years back, and they like came across the table at me denying the truth of this. And then I challenged them. I said, well, which one of you did an algorithm on whether to go to MIT or Stanford? Like, which one of you did an algorithm or a spreadsheet on who to marry? Right? Which one of you did an algorithm on whether to take that job or not? We are emotionally, highly emotional and highly complicated creatures. And so if you're trying to figure out how to innovate in a way where whoever they is, adopts whatever you've built, you've got to contemplate that complexity and understand it as well as you understand all the other stuff. And so my simple mashup of all of this is that humans look at every decision, every choice through a lens that's really an ROI lens, return on investment lens, and we look at it through these 5 facets: time, money, function, and I think the big ones, and that's why they're bolded, are the physiological and psychological ones. And I'm going to prove that in a couple of cases in a second. But there's a guy who said everything I just said over the last 7 minutes in a lot simpler fashion. And his name is Henry David Thoreau. Was Henry David Thoreau, I guess. And he said it this way: the cost of a thing is the amount of life you pay for it. Think about that. You give, not just from the wallet. You give from the heart, you give from the head. There are a multitude of things happening to determine whether that thing that is being offered you is worth it to you, worth what you're about to give. And again, I don't think as business people, as marketers, as humans who walk the earth, we spend any amount of time thinking about what that give, what that ask really is. So here's a case. You know these guys. They did have a $130 billion valuation until the IPO. But is that valuation based on their ability to get people from point A to point B? Really? It's not. Ray said this yesterday at our boot camp. It's not, Uber is not a holy shit technology, right? It's a new business model. But why was Uber adopted so readily? I mean, if you've ever seen the adoption curve on Uber, it is stunning, or on car sharing generally, it is stunning. So what's going on there? Well, let's look at it through the lens of Maslow. Sure, it meets my physiological need of getting from point A to point B. Got it. The big one, this is the big one to me. Uber gives me a sense of control. Anybody here remember taxis? Do you remember the anxiety associated with taxis? Where you'd call a cab, or you'd be standing on the corner in Manhattan trying to get to LaGuardia, and you're late for your flight, and you're just like freaking out, right? Remember this? Uber eliminates freaking out. It puts us in control. It makes us feel safe. I think there's an element of Uber that's it's kind of like Starbucks. It's part of my identity. I'm an Uber guy, or I'm a Lyft person. And this is where I start stretching a little bit, but I think there's some validity. It makes me feel better about myself, again, because I'm in control. I mean, so much of life is about us. It's back to Maslow's view of us as primal creatures, is about being in control. And then the last one, it's just part of how I live. I am free. Uber gives me freedom to actualize my existence. Holy shit. Now, there's a dark side to all this, captured by Reid Hoffman, who is the founder of LinkedIn. This is a speech he gave fairly recently. And the gist of it is, yes, the Maslowian pyramid applies, but there's another sort of side to that pyramid, which is it's all about the 7 deadly sins. And this is sort of the point about validation, that a large percentage of our behavior is motivated not just by the sort of front part of that pyramid, but the side angle, which is about lust and gluttony and greed and sloth. And the crazy part of this statement is Reid Hoffman says, these are fundamentals for having a fulfilling quality of life. Like, seriously? But it's depressing, but it's actually true. So there's another darkness in all this. This graveyard is a graveyard of all the innovators who failed. The 75%, the 84%, the 95%, they all failed. And the reason why they failed is because they focused on building the function versus affecting adoption of the function. And that's really what I've been talking about. If you want your innovation to work, to be adopted, you've got to really understand who they are and what they care about and what their needs and issues are. And the operative word here is adoption. Adoption is not buying. Adoption is not subscribing. Adoption is not licensing. Adoption is not renting. Adoption means to take by choice into a relationship. And I think of a mother and child in this scenario, or a parent and child adopting, like to internalize that proposition in a way that it actually becomes part of who you are, right? Or an extension of who you are. Think of all the apps you have on the fourth screen on your phone that you downloaded, and you can't even remember what they are, right? You haven't gone there in years. That's not adoption. So I want to sort of cut over to this question of digital transformation. I talked earlier about 84% of it fails. That's crazy, right? 900 billion wasted. So the question is why? And there's a study done last year by CIO Magazine, and it came up with these answers. Number one, this is hilarious, right? The reason why digital transformation fails is because the buyers of it don't actually know what it is. What? Humans are complicated. Number two, the CEO doesn't know what it is. Number three, lack of focus. I'm not sure what that means. This is my favorite, right? This is Maslow. And I'm going to prove that to you in a second. And anyway, the list goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. We just blunder our way into this shit without actually understanding why we're doing it, what it is, how it works, and particularly, as Ray said, the people part of the equation. It's just a thing. Kaylee and I were talking yesterday, the day before, about, innovation is not a thing, it's a way of being. Digital transformation is not a thing, it's a way of being. So here's my why. That's CIO's why, this is my why. The reason why digital transformation fails is because the benefits don't outweigh the costs. And I'm not talking about 900 billion or 1.3 trillion, I'm talking about other costs. Remember multivariate costs? Here are the costs through the lens of Maslow. One of the big ones, foundational, physiological, right? Remember primal cavemen people. We cannot let go of the familiarity of the past and the present. We are pattern creatures. Even if the present is broken, the present is dysfunctional, because it's familiar to us, we would rather hold on to that than step out into the infinite horizon of the new. Number two, blank slates scare the hell out of us. We were talking the other day about, a bank that I've been talking to said we don't have time to do thinking work. I'm like, that's not true. You have time to do thinking work. The reason why you don't do it is because it's scary. Because if you're in your office just staring at the ceiling, there's a pressure to perform. Whereas if you're just sitting there returning emails, you had a good day. So blank slate scares, and it gives us a sense of feeling out of control. What if the new model that we invent doesn't actually need us? That's kind of a buzzkill. One of my favorites, we won't accept we don't know what we need to know. This is true. If you believe something, this research says if you believe something and I give you data that refutes what you actually believe what you believe more. And so our ability to sort of delude ourselves into thinking we don't need to know this stuff is amazing. And then the last one is this. We don't really believe we're vulnerable. We don't really believe this disruption thing has happened. We don't really believe we have to transform digitally. We don't really believe that this bank that's been in existence for 50, 100 years is somehow going to go out of business. We don't believe it. Quick story here. Years ago, I was working with Polaroid, sitting with the 7 senior executives talking about strategy. This is when they were doing pretty well, but I could see this thing happening in the market. And so I stood up at a whiteboard and I drew this little bump on the whiteboard. It might have been a blackboard, it was a long time ago. And I said, gentlemen, do you understand what this is? And they said, no, what is that? And I said, that is a swell in the ocean called digital imaging. And if you don't take evasive action, that swell will turn into a tsunami that crushes your company. And they all looked at me, and they were like 6 or 7 old white guys. And they all looked at me and said, no, that's not going to happen. That's going to take 25 years. 6 years later, Polaroid was out of business. And I realized in retrospect, it's not that they actually didn't believe me, it's that they didn't want to believe me. Because if they believed me, they would have to take evasive action, right? They would have to blow up the business as they knew it. They'd have to adopt new ways of thinking. They would have to change. And none of them wanted to change. And so they were all calculating, if I can just make it 5 more years, I can make it to retirement. And this is somebody else's problem. But it ended up being their problem. So the next question is, well, how do you How do you not fail at digital transformation? And this is I have a lot of theories, I have a lot of frameworks, graphs that have no data to support them whatsoever. I just make it up. But I think this one is possibly true. There are only two motivators of behavior change. Only two: aspiration and desperation. That's it. The problem with aspiration is it only gets you so far. Aspiration is a want thing. People, I want to lose weight. I've been wanting to lose weight for a long time. It hasn't happened because I want to, I don't need to. The minute I need to, I will. Desperation is far more effective, far more effective. And so if you look at what's going on in digital transformation in the financial services arena and the spending of $1.3 trillion, the question is, what's motivating that? Is it aspiration or desperation? And I have a theory that is actually neither. There's a third bucket or a third category, which we're going to call just because. This goes back to the number one reason digital transformation fails is because they don't actually know what it is. They're just doing it because they went to a conference and they heard that they should do it. So then they go back to the office and go, boss, we got to do this thing. What's the thing? It's digital transformation. What is it? I don't know. It's like a scene out of The Office. Okay, so here's my advice. And for those in the boot camp, I apologize for being a little redundant, but repetition can be a good thing. So my view is the only way to survive this thing called disruption, whatever the hell you want to call it perpetual, incessant change. The only way to survive is to create a motivation that the entire organization can attach to. My view is it probably needs to be a form of desperation, or absent that, some sort of grand aspiration. Plant a flag around that, and then create a culture. Remember, it's all about people. Ray said it, I said it. Create a culture that marches to realize that vision or that aspiration or desperation. And so, more specifically, 7 things. Do this. Do this. Absent this, people will walk around in circles. 2, make it part of how you run the business. Don't make it additive. I talked yesterday about the difference between synthetic innovation and organic innovation. Don't create some special team to work on this. Make it how you run the business. Your planning, this is from my work at Harvard. The planning process to me is all about alignment. How do we align vision, mission, objectives, strategies, priorities, actions, cultures, values, beliefs? How do we ensure that every individual in the organization is marching towards that flag? And my question to you, and this is just something to ponder for like 5 seconds, are you aligned within your organization? And my guess is not so much. And so that's something to work on. 3, every organization, we talked yesterday about the idea that a culture is actually just a derivative. A culture isn't a thing, really. It's a consequence. It is a consequence of the behaviors of the organization, and particularly the unwritten rules of the organization. Your organizations are guided not by what's on the cafeteria wall, but by what is generally understood by the majority of your employees. And in many cases, the unwritten rules of an organization are counter to the aspiration of creating a culture of innovation. 4, there's this idea captured by, it's not an idea, I think it's a perspective captured by Google. They did a research study a couple years ago trying to figure out why certain teams within Google perform better than other teams. And ultimately what they realized is the teams that reflect psychological safety, where the teams trust each other, believe in each other, are willing to be transparent to each other without fear of recrimination or rejection, those are the high-performing teams. And so if you think about that through the lens of your own organization, is your organization psychologically safe? Do people feel free to be vulnerable with each other? to actually share in full transparency what they believe, what they think, what ideas they have without fear of recrimination or rejection. 5, this is, Ray said this, and I can't underscore this enough. The capacity of any organization to be innovative, to be able to adapt to the constant change, is simply a function of the capacity of the individuals within it to be innovative and to adapt. The problem is the majority of individuals are not naturally adaptive and natural learners. Most individuals are not naturally curious, are not naturally agile, are not actually open. And so part of your job, whether your organization is a department within the organization or your organization is the whole organization, part of your job is to actively develop the people within it, to nudge them and push them and motivate them to become active learners. 6, you've got to have metrics around this. I've been talking to a very large, very, 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 very large bank about helping them with culture of innovation stuff. And I said, well, the first thing we have to decide is, what is it? Like, how will you know when it exists? And more specifically, what are the measures of it? What are the metrics? So I came up with a bunch, but the ones that are important to me is under the leadership bucket, behavior change. Is the leadership behaving? I mean, here's the other sort of terrible truth. If the leadership of an organization doesn't change its behavior, why would the organization itself change its behavior? If any of you are parents, you know how this works. The children do what you do. They don't do what you don't do. So if you aren't going to change, they aren't going to change. And this last one is kind of that point. If you put this on everybody else, it's their problem. Actually, we did Celent and Fintech Americas did a survey. Some of you filled it out, I think, prior to. Yeah, familiar? Kaylee and I were laughing about this. The funny thing is, one of the questions was, how well equipped do you think you are? And 60-some% of you said you were really well equipped to deal with change. And then the question was, how well equipped do you think everybody else in your organization is? And your answer was 30%. My view on that is like, okay, that may or may not be true, but it's like, you're not well equipped. Nobody's well equipped. I'm not well equipped. We actually don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Nobody does. And so being open to your own evolution and saying, listen, I don't know, but I'm going to be, as Ray said, a lifelong learner and embrace learning, not around the technology, but learning about the humanity is now my number one responsibility. So there's another lens, and I'm running over, so I'm going to go through this quickly. There's another lens that this question is really important for, and that is, do we understand humanity well enough vis-a-vis the long-term effects of our innovations? Remember the slide about 1 in 4 college kids are on medication, on psychotropic drugs, blah, 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 blah. Do we understand the unintended consequences of what we are building, what we are doing, particularly around technology? And my view is the answer is no. The unintended consequences can kill us and are killing us. And so as you go forward as innovators within your organization and out in the world, I think there's a responsibility to carry with it, not just a focus on humanity to ensure your short-term innovation success, but a focus on the long-term consequences of whatever it is we are doing. And I know that's hard as hell, but I think we have to try. I spoke at a conference last year with Ash Carter on this very topic of responsibility in technology, and he said this: the pace of change cannot be slowed, but it can and must be steered. We have a responsibility as citizens of the world to care about the downstream consequences. He also said this: we need to match technical innovation with ethical innovation. The funny thing about the word ethical or ethics, in the United States, I'm convinced if I walked up to 99% of Americans and said, what are ethics, they wouldn't be able to answer the question. When I went to business school, I had one 45-minute class on ethics and 2 entire courses on marketing. That's a problem. In the fintech space, you hear a lot about the underbanked. And I think it's amazing, right? The idea that blockchain technology, can somehow provide financial service capacity to people that don't currently have it, right? I think that's amazing. And everybody's talking about financial inclusion. But the scary part to me is nobody is talking about financial literacy. So do you know what happens when you give something like a credit instrument to a human being who doesn't actually understand credit? The subprime mortgage collapse. That's what happened. So we have a responsibility. My point in all this is we have a responsibility not just to innovate for ourselves and for our present customers, but we have a responsibility to innovate in ways that are ethical and considerate of long-term consequences in our society at large. The good news is there's a movement happening. There's all sorts of stuff happening. Humanism is coming to the fore because the backlash is real, and we all feel it on a daily basis. There's this book that was written. I wrote a piece on LinkedIn about the future of books and banks that's very much about this. Tim Cook from Apple was talking about this at an EU conference last spring. And he said this, which I think is just profound. To infuse the technologies we make with the humanity that makes us. This is Kaylee's favorite slide. So there's this guy named Sir John Glubb in the 1920s. I think he worked at Oxford. He was a professor, and he studied empires his whole career. And he arrived at this conclusion that the average life of an empire, the shelf life of an empire, is always about the same. 150, 200 years. Going back to the Assyrians and the Mongols and the Egyptians, they all last. The peak is around 200 years. And he points out these fundamental stages of every empire, and I believe it applies to every empire, every country, and every large company. And it may even apply to your bank or your organization. You start out as a pioneer, you move to conquest, you acquire other banks, other organizations, you move to commerce, things stabilize, you start believing you're really good at this stuff, you move to affluence, things are really good, you have a nice house, a nice car, you then start losing connection with humanity. You then start innovating for yourselves versus innovating for your customers, and that is the beginning of the end. And in the end, you start belly button gazing, the age of the intellect, and then all of a sudden, it's the age of decadence, and Nero is playing the fiddle, and then it's over. And so the question is, how do you avoid those latter stages? And the way to avoid those latter stages is this, is to look at everything you do, every move you make, every innovation you create, not through the lens of you, but through the lens of the other person. And to apply what I said at the beginning, the 1% I want you to remember is getting really good at the capacity to understand the truth of the human is everything. So the reason why technology is dead, it's not dead. And by the way, I love technology. And if you read the Enlightenment Now book, he will say to you, technology has had a profound impact on lots of lives. But the problem with technology is technology for technology's sake. That the way we can extract the value out of technology, the way to make the inanimate animate of technology is by getting really good at the human. Decoding humans instead of writing code. And so the last question is really not a question, it's a request. That as you go forward today, tomorrow, and into your lives, don't go forward as bankers, don't go forward as consultants, don't go forward as developers, front-end experienced designers. Go forward as humans, committed to trying to understand ourselves, understand each other's, understanding our customers, understanding the world, so that whatever we create has a better chance of being successful in the short term and particularly successful in the long term and for our society. And so I came up with this term the other day, which I think is sort of cute. Right? You get my point? All right, thanks very much.